안녕하세요. What a gift to be back in Seoul. President Obama visited here 4 times as president, the most of any country in Asia. And he always said our relationship proved how much allies can achieve together and underscored that alliances as vital as ours are at their core less about a relationship between governments and more about a relationship between peoples. And that's why I'm so happy to be here. But I'll be honest, it is more fun to be here without President Obama, to be able to get out and get lost a little bit. So thank you for having me. 감사합니다. I have been asked to do 2 specific things today. One, to share with you all the great secrets of speechwriting, which makes me think this is a trap, that some AI invited me and is taking careful notes. And 2, I've been asked to offer some thoughts on the future of speechwriting in the age of AI, which also makes me think this is a trap, that someone thought it would be funny to hear a speechwriter deliver their own eulogy. Well, the joke's on them. Eulogies are what I do best. But that is not what I'm here to deliver today. I've been a speechwriter for 20 years now. For 14 of those years, I wrote with President Obama, and for 8 of those years, I was his chief speechwriter. And along the way, with him as a mentor and a friend, I developed a particular approach to speechwriting. Today, alongside the world's best speechwriters at a company called Fenway, we apply that approach to helping everybody from Fortune 100 CEOs and startup founders, philanthropists and academics, cultural icons, and world-class athletes speak with clarity and purpose and power. I teach that approach at my alma mater, Northwestern University in Chicago, in what students call the #1 class to take before you graduate. I illustrate that approach in my book, Grace, President Obama in 10 Days in the Battle for America, and I spill all the secrets there. And I'm going to tell you a bit about that approach today. Now, the fundamentals of great speechwriting is something that I teach to my students on a weekly basis. But I've only got a few minutes here, so let's run through the basics. First, talk like a human being. It sounds like common sense, I know, but think about how many politicians and CEOs do not sound like human beings, right? Half the stuff that they say already sounds AI generated. Boring, uninspiring, focus grouped, neutral jargon designed to make no waves, to offend nobody. I can't tell you how many times the head of communications at a corporation has approached me to ask if I could make their boss sound interesting, only ultimately to hear them say, "Oh, no, we can't say that." And I understand the impulse to be risk averse, to protect your boss, but it's hard for your boss to break through. It's hard for somebody to be a thought leader if you put your poll numbers or your stock prices ahead of original thoughts. A few years back, the president of one of the world's largest companies approached me to write for her, and she told me, "My speeches are boring. They're supposed to be boring. Can you write boring?" "Sure, I can write boring," I shrugged, "but what if instead your speeches weren't boring?" She didn't hire me, which is too bad, because she struck me as warm and interesting, and her speeches should be warm and interesting too. Rule number 2, say what only you can say. What do I mean by this? Well, what if I had missed my 15-hour flight to Seoul? Could I have asked somebody else to come up and read this in my place? Of course not. Every speech should be rooted in the speaker's own thoughts, own values, own experiences. So those are my first 2 rules. Talk like a human and say what only you can say. Third, don't forget you're writing for a live audience. Speechwriting is not for the reading eye, it's for the listening ear. You can't go back 2 paragraphs to reread a point that I just made. As speechwriters, we have to give you, the audience, a map of where you are in the speech by signposting, like I just did by repeating my first 2 rules and bringing you to the third, by summarizing what's been said, by previewing what's coming forward. As writers, we have to keep you engaged with varied, vivid language techniques. We get to conduct a live audience, telling you with our words and body language when to laugh, when to applaud, when to cry, maybe even when to do all 3 at once. Obama used to describe his interactions with the audience as a current of emotion that passes back and forth between you and the crowd, a sense of connection that overrides our differences and replaces them with a giant swell of possibility. That current carries me to my fourth rule. Don't fear emotion, embrace it. If a speaker is too afraid to share an idea or share something of themselves, and a lot of them are, then how do they ever connect with the people who come to see them speak? Logic alone is not enough to win over an audience. There are studies on this. The more you beat your audience over the head with facts, the less they believe you. But you can win them over by making them feel something, by uniting around shared values and experiences. If you open yourself up, the audience might do the same. Now, there's a lot more I could share about structure, anecdote, humor, delivery, and all of that is important too, but those are the big ones. Talk like a human being. Say what only you can say. Remember your audience and embrace emotion. Now, can AI replicate some of that? Sure. And I want to be careful what I say here. I don't want to make the AI mad because I know it's translating my speech for you. You can feed it your life story. You can prompt it to write like a human, to throw in some alliteration and epistrophe, to conjure up a little emotion. And the AI will do what it does best. It will scrape existing content on the internet, start a speech the way it sees most speeches start, predict what might come next, maybe craft a few transitions, even toss in a decent metaphor or two. But I chose the word replicate for a reason, because ultimately what comes out is still just a dull composite of existing language that is, by definition, average. It's text that sounds like something you've heard 100 times because you have. Now, for routine corporate or political communications, that's fine, as long as you're okay with routine and fine. But if you want to be great, that takes something more. That takes storytelling, and that takes collaboration. When it came to any speech of consequence, President Obama was actively involved in the product from start to finish. We'd sit down in the Oval Office, and he'd always begin with one question: what's the story we're trying to tell? That's what we always tried to do with our speeches, to tell a story that people can see themselves in, to paint a picture of how we got to this moment and what it means in the longer continuum of America and the world, to present a set of choices about where we could go from here, to point people in a certain direction by tapping into shared values and ideals, hopes and fears, passions and contradictions. Once we had his direction, we would get to work, start pecking away, and get him a draft the night before the speech. He would then often work on it himself until 2 or 3 in the morning. And this may sound counterintuitive, but it was always a good thing to see that he had a lot of edits to the speech. It didn't mean he didn't like what we'd written. It meant he liked it enough to engage with it and make it better. And that's what made writing for him such a wonderful struggle. He was, perhaps more than any president before him, maybe save for Abraham Lincoln, a writer. So we would torture ourselves trying to get him a draft that would impress him. I was notorious for sleeping in my West Wing office. But here's the thing, he never asked us for perfection. He only asked us to get him something that he could work with. He viewed the job as a creative partnership, a collaboration where we could make each other better, where we could take each other to places that we couldn't reach by ourselves. Now, let's be honest, in our more than 3,000 speeches together, that didn't always happen. But sometimes it did. Let me give you one example, and for this, we have to go back in time 60 years. In 1965, when Obama was 3 years old, in the American state of Alabama, in the tiny town of Selma, a group of Americans gathered in a church one morning and set out to march on their state capital to petition for their right to vote. Now understand, they already had this right. but it had been systematically been denied to them for decades through all sorts of unsavory means. So these protesters were not asking for special treatment. They were just asking for the equal treatment that their country promised them. Now, their march barely made it over the bridge out of town when their nonviolent protest was met with violent suppression. Tear gas, attack dogs, the crack of bone, baton on bone, and fire hose on flesh. And the images of young, unarmed Americans beaten and bloodied on our own streets shocked the conscience of the country and ultimately paved the way for voting rights legislation. 10 years ago, Obama visited that bridge to commemorate the 50th anniversary of that march. And you might think writing that speech would be easy, right? 50 years after Black Americans risked their lives to vote, a Black president returns. The symbolism writes itself, right? But to be a speechwriter for Barack Obama was never easy. He never let a captive audience go to waste. I knew he'd demand something more than just praising that moment in history. To meet his expectations demanded using that moment as a lens to examine our history and to give a new generation of Americans a way forward. So I anticipated his usual question, what's the story we're trying to tell? Well, the way I saw it, on one side of that bridge stood the power of the state, the status quo. White men who, even if they weren't individually powerful or privileged, belonged to a class protected by people who were. A ruling elite who warned them that America was a zero-sum game, that giving equal rights to others meant giving away their own traditional station in society. On the other side of that bridge gathered the powerless, mostly young, mostly Black, mostly poor, Americans who, even though their country had betrayed them again and again, were filled with faith and didn't despair or grow cynical, but persevered, believing that they could push their country nearly 200 years after its founding into finally becoming a full democracy. What happened in Selma was the story of America as we saw it. A never-ending battle to live up to the lofty ideals of our founding, that all of us are created equal. And so it was my job to draft a speech to be delivered on that sacred battleground by a president of the United States who could not be impartial because he represented something primal to both sides of this struggle we're still going through today. Someone who represented change, like it or not. Now, in an incredible stroke of luck, a blizzard hit Washington 2 days before the speech. And with most of the White House staff working from home, I stole Obama's schedule for myself. I walked a first draft through the empty West Wing to the Oval Office and sat on his couch while he read it in silence, the blowing snow whispering like a jazz brush on the windows. And after a while, he stood up and said, "Oh, this is well written. I could probably deliver it as is." But I could feel a but coming. But we have 2 days, so let's make it better. And with his meetings pulled down, we spent a whole hour just sitting and talking about the story he wanted to tell. I'd been writing with him for 8 years by this point, so I knew that provoking him was a good way to get his creative juices flowing. So I poked him and asked how he felt about the part of the country that spent years calling him un-American, a traitor, a terrorist, not a product of the American story, but a threat to it. Now, people often ask me what he's like in person, and the truth is, he's the same as he is in public. He just swears a lot more. So he said, "Who gives a beep? Who are they to decide what it means to be an American? Anyone can say my flag is bigger than your flag, but that doesn't make you a patriot. I'd argue, if you want to see a patriot, look at those kids in Selma who were so committed to making their country better that they were willing to get their heads cracked open for it. That's what makes America great," he said. There has always been a tension between the high ideals of our founding and how short we fall of them. But we're at our best when we mind that tension, when we work to close that gap because we believe that we can. And then he grinned and handed me the draft and said, go write that up. And together we came up with a thesis. What could be more American than what happened in this place? What could more profoundly vindicate the idea of America than plain and humble people, the unsung, the downtrodden, the dreamers not of high station, not born to wealth or privilege, not of one religious tradition or many, coming together to shape their country's course? What greater expression of faith in the American experiment than this? What greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that we are not yet finished, that we are strong enough to be self-critical, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is within our power to remake this nation to more closely reflect our highest ideals? Selma was not a clash of armies, but a clash of wills, a contest to determine the true meaning of America. And we passed 5 drafts back and forth that day in the world's most secure snow globe, each one getting better than the last, each one adding new unsung heroes and stories from our past that anybody can see themselves in. So if there's one Obama speech that everyone should watch, that's it. It's big and fun and joyous and meant to fill you with purpose. It might read a little alien these days, but it remains the purest distillation of what America at our best can be. And that, my friends, is the true secret of speechwriting. It's not a one-person job. It's a two-way street. It's not just one frazzled writer toiling away at the desk and the other person coolly reading it from a lectern. It's a collaboration that unfolds 24 hours a day, shooting ideas back and forth about what you're reading and watching, what's happening in the world, what your kids are talking about at home. Those conversations aren't somehow separate from speechwriting. They are essential to it. You get to know someone inside and out, their values, their worldview, their hopes, fears, and sense of humor until you don't need prompts. You already know what they want to say, and more importantly, you know why they want to say it. And that kind of collaboration requires 2 things that are in short supply these days: time and trust. I tell anyone who comes to me looking for a speechwriter that they need to spend time with that speechwriter, or they shouldn't even bother. If the most powerful man in the world can give his speechwriters time every single day, then so can a CEO. And I don't just mean give them access to private meetings. Give them access to something truly sensitive: your dreams, your doubts, your half-formed ideas. Make them a confidant. Most relationships between executives and their comms teams just don't reach that level, and that's too bad. Because if you can't get beyond surface-level relationships, then when the stuff hits the fan, whether it's a crisis or layoffs or lousy earnings or anything else, then you won't have anything to offer besides surface-level platitudes. If your speechwriter and your head of comms barely know you, then they're going to make you sound like everybody else. But if you bring them in, if you make them confidants, they will make you sound like the best version of yourself. Let me share a technique that I use with new clients. I ask them, aliens have finally arrived on Earth. How do you explain to them what your company does and why they should care? Now, why do I ask this? Think back to my first 2 rules. Talk like a human being and say only what you can say. This question forces people out of corporate speak and into human speak. You can't fall back on focus group mission statements or industry jargon. You have to think quickly and fundamentally about value and purpose. You have to focus your language in a way that's clear and colloquial. And here's the fun part to watch. It's not just what they say, it's how they say it. Do they know the answer? Do they know what their company does and why people should care? Do they struggle to find words, or do they get excited about what they do? Do they immediately start riffing off product features, or do they actually tell a story that connects? Right away, it tells me everything I need to know about working with someone. There are plenty of things that AI can do well. There are plenty of things that I am rooting for AI to do well. But when it comes to communication, AI assumes that it's primarily about information transfer. If you give it the right inputs, it will produce coherent outputs. But that's not right. It's wrong. Communication is not about information transfer. Communication is about emotional transfer. The most important speeches are not about organizing facts or even crafting arguments. They're about creating human connection right when people are most frantically searching for a way to make sense of things. Another one of Obama's most famous speeches, the one that's the centerpiece of my book, was a eulogy he delivered in Charleston, South Carolina. Also 10 years ago, after a white supremacist murdered 9 black worshipers in a black church. You might remember it as the speech where Obama sang Amazing Grace. In preparing that speech, he told me that he wanted to tackle America's legacy of racism, guns, and the Confederacy. 3 of the third rails of our politics that most politicians are terrified to touch. And he wanted me to do it all through the lens of redemptive grace. I promise you that is not a suggestion you're going to get from ChatGPT. I spent 3 days and 3 nights struggling to write remarks that met that moment. And when I finally handed it to the boss and he read it, he crossed out the entire second half of the speech, a big line through each page, and rewrote it in 3 hours. And I did something I'd never done before. I apologized for letting him down. He just stared at me and said, "Brother, we're collaborators. You didn't let me down. You gave me exactly what I needed. You'll see your work in there. And besides, when you've been thinking about these issues for 40 years, you'll know what you want to say too." He had spent decades living the reality of being a black man in America. Not reading about it, not scraping other people's writing about it, but feeling the weight of it. He'd spent 8 years in office navigating the expectations, the projections, the burden of representing an entire race every time he opened his mouth. He understood grace not as a theological concept, but as a lived reality. He'd seen it in his own life, in the forgiveness of people who had every reason to be bitter, in the letters he read at night from ordinary people who chose love over hate, even when hate can be easier. He understood the black church not from Wikipedia, but from sitting in its pews every Sunday. He knew the rhythm of a congregation that actively participates in a sermon. And that's how he had no doubt that when he surprised everybody by taking a deep breath and singing Amazing Grace, that they would join in and sing along. Rule number 3, know your audience. AI wouldn't have suggested singing Amazing Grace because you can't understand what Amazing Grace means if you haven't been moved to tears by singing it. What it means to somebody who's suffering if you've never suffered yourself. That moment, that leap of faith came from a lifetime of learning what was needed, when it was needed, and how best to deliver it. So when it comes to AI, we are in the middle of a communications arms race, but it's not what most people think. It's not about who can generate content fastest and cheapest. It's about who can create the most real, authentic, and meaningful human connection in an increasingly chaotic and artificial world. The leaders and organizations who win that arms race will be the ones who invest in meaning over metrics, trust over the transitory, the sway of story over the sameness of slop. And the communicators who will survive this race are the ones who master something more than prompts, but deep listening, relationship building, cultural fluency, and one of my old boss's greatest strengths, moral imagination. Moral imagination, it's that ability to see beyond our own immediate interests, the capacity to inspire people to pursue their better angels for the sake of all posterity. Now, I believe that the story Obama told about America and the world is the right one in the long run. That doesn't mean the right story always wins. It is tough to wake up every day and watch the fire hoses now train not only on the poor and the powerless, but also on science and public health, immigrants and civil society, diplomacy and fundamental decency. But I will tell you, in this disorienting era of fractured reality and shattered attention spans, in navigating this great transition, there is an enormous opportunity for the leaders who come up with a new and better shared story that focuses us, one that makes sense of the chaos, offers a positive vision of the future, and inspires people into action that takes us there. That is a collaboration I am always looking for, and I look forward to our discussion today. 감사합니다.